Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Creek's End today, this last Sunday of April. Wow, this year's passing fast, isn't it? Geesh. If you're watching online, we want to welcome you as well. Glad you joined us. Maybe you're watching on YouTube later on. That's great. It's kind of an emotional day for me, as in case this is your first time here or you haven't been here in a while. This is my last Sunday to be here until September. I'm going to be going on a 4-month sabbatical to recharge and but be sure that I will be back. And I have my spies out here making sure that you're here while I'm gone. All right? Now, really, seriously, I really want you to support our ministry team by being here, being faithful. I know summer, there's a lot of vacation time, but that's great. We all need that. But please be here if at all possible while you're in town. I plan on being in church every Sunday somewhere in the United States. And we have a little trip planned to where we're pulling our camper toward the East Coast. I'm going to eventually get to Virginia Beach, where my brothers are. I haven't seen them for 5 years. And we're going to visit with them, go to church with them. But on the meanwhile, we're going to be driving towards there, and we're going to go to church with some friends in Jackson, Mississippi, that we haven't seen in a while. And then we're going on to Atlanta to go to church with some of you remember Frank Bennett, who helped us get started here at Creek's End. Well, he planted a church north of Atlanta. So we're going to spend Sunday with them there, and then I'll be in my brother's church. And so we're going to be in church somewhere all summer, and I hope that you'll do the same. Even if you're on vacation, go to church somewhere. Check out some churches and see what they're doing, and then come back and tell me what we can do better. I would love to do that. So anyway, we're going to be worshiping, and I hope that you'll just support our ministry team by being here. And part of the reason that I am going is to recharge and rest, but also, just like you, I struggle with thrones in my life, and I need to make sure that God sits on every single throne of my life in every single area, and that's what I'm going to be doing while I'm gone, as I'm spending some time with God and getting direction and purpose and meaning for what He wants us to do when I get back and where He wants our church to go. So it's bittersweet, and I know my daughter picked out this shirt for me to wear, and it kind of says Jimmy Buffett all over it, doesn't it? And I'm like, is that what I'm about to have? Is, Margaritaville for the next 3 months? I don't know. But anyway, I am looking forward to being back. Believe me, I'm going to miss you terribly. But please pray for us while we're away, that God will refresh us and give us a really big heart for what He wants us to do when we get back. When I first became a Christian, I didn't get into this because I loved God or wanted to follow Jesus. I became a Christian because I didn't want to go to hell. I wanted to go to heaven. So really, when I first became a Christian, it was about me. And some of you may have that dynamic in your life. Maybe that's why you came to Christ, because you wanted to go to heaven. Or you just wanted some peace because your life was troubled. Maybe there was a tragedy. Or maybe your marriage was shattered and you knew someone who went to church and their marriage was healed, and you thought, well, if I go to church, maybe my marriage will be healed. But for whatever reason that was, it was about you. And when things are about you, that means that you have a kingdom and you sit on the throne. And it's very, very hard, as we've talked about this whole series, to give up control of the thrones of our life. And it's a game that we play, a game of thrones, where when we say, God, I want you to sit there, and when He gets ready to sit there, we pull the chair out from under Him, and we don't allow Him to sit on that throne. It's hard to give up control. Well, that's what we're going to talk about today, because if I've learned anything, I've learned this. We must abdicate the throne, or our agenda will clash with His agenda. See, when you have a kingdom, you have an agenda, and your agenda is about you. But God has an agenda for your life. And if we don't abdicate the throne, our agenda will clash with His. And when our agendas clash, there are consequences for that. Many of you are already paying the consequences for your agenda clashing with His. You decided to go with your agenda instead of His, and you're paying the consequences for that. In your marriage, in your finances, in your health, in your career. So if you have a Bible, I want you to turn to John chapter 18. We're going to be in two chapters, 18 and 19 today. And this truth that we're going to talk about today was a part of an encounter that Jesus had. And this encounter was with a guy whom we know as Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate, is his claim to fame, if you want to call it that, in history was that he had Jesus crucified. But that was not his ambition. In fact, he wanted to do more than that, because just a few years before this encounter, the emperor Tiberius Caesar Augustus appointed Pilate to be the prefect, or governor, if you will, of the area about 3/4 of the area that we know as modern-day Israel. In fact, let me put a map up here, and maybe you can tell. The area that's north in Galilee, that was under the control of King Herod, who was a Jewish puppet king, but nevertheless, he was reigned over that area. But from Samaria on down to Judea, that was all Pilate's area. He was the prefect or governor of that area, and his word was law. I mean, he was large and in charge. And there were two things that Rome wanted Pilate to do: collect taxes and keep the peace. And as long as Pilate collected taxes and kept the peace, then he was allowed to stay in control. Now, Pilate was very good at collecting taxes. He was pretty good at keeping the peace. But this system that he had of collecting taxes, and in the New Testament, you can read about all these things about tax collectors, irritated the heck out of the Jewish people. Because these tax collectors could set up a table anywhere, a bridge, a road, a fork in the road, and they could collect taxes, just anything they wanted to. And that really irritated the Jewish people. And not only that, I mean, they hated Pilate, but Pilate hated them. On 2 or 3 occasions, he would send his troops into the quarters of Jerusalem and for no reason at all slaughter Jewish people. And on one occasion, he took his troops into the temple and robbed the temple treasury so that he could build an aqueduct in the city. He hated the Jews. The Jews hated him, but he was in charge. He was in control, and there was nothing that they could do about it. So as we open up into this slice of Jesus' life before he's crucified, here's what's happening. It's 7:30 in the morning. Jesus has been up all night because he's been arrested and put before the religious leaders and the high priest and the high priest's father-in-law as well, and accused of blasphemy and condemned of blasphemy, and they want Jesus to die. And not only do they want Jesus to die, they want him crucified. See, crucifixion was only one form of Roman execution. There were other ways to die, but crucifixion was saved for the worst of criminals, to make an example of in front of everyone who passed by. So they wanted him crucified. They wanted him to be an example to anyone who claimed to be God or claimed to be the Son of God. So Jesus has been up all night. They've had this mock trial. They want him to die, but they don't have the authority, the Jewish leaders, to crucify Jesus. In fact, they don't have the authority to put anyone to death. They have to go and get permission from guess who? Pilate. So it's 7:30 in the morning, and they're heading to Pilate's palace to get permission to put Jesus to death. Not only put him to death, but to crucify Jesus. Now, this reminds them who's in charge. Pilate's in charge. It makes Pilate happy because it reminds them who's in charge. And that's where we're going to open up. That's what's happening. And what's happening is they send an attendant in to get Pilate to come out to them. Pilate sends the attendant back and says, "No, you come in here." So there's a little game going on. "No, you come in here." Well, the religious leader says, "No, we can't because," and here's what's interesting, it's 12 hours before Passover begins. And so they've got to get him dead and crucified before Passover starts. So they're in a hurry, and they need Pilate to cooperate. So when Pilate says, I want you to come in, well, they send word back through the attendant, we can't come in because we're ceremonially clean for Passover. And if we go into a pagan's home, that will make us unclean, which irritates Pilate. You want me to do you a favor, and yet you won't even come in. So Pilate just says, all right, you guys stay out there. You send in Jesus, this guy who you want crucified, and I'll deal with him. So that's where we are when we open up, okay? So we're in John 18, and we're going to begin in verse 33. And as we read, I just want to point out some things about what it means to give up control of the throne. Here's where the conversation begins. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Now, this is not the first time that you will notice in all of these verses that we'll read that he refers to him as king. Are you the king of the Jews? Is that your own idea? Jesus asked. Or did others talk to you about me? Am I a Jew? Kind of facetious, Pilate replied. Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you have done? In other words, why are they so irritated and so upset and all in a rush to get you crucified today before Passover? Verse 36, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place. Now you imagine if you're Pilate hearing that. Okay, so you're a king of another place. You're a king then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on this side of truth listens to me. And look at what Pilate says. What is truth? Retorted Pilate. Who cares about truth? Truth is irrelevant. Power is what it's about. Control is what it's about. What's relevant is being able to do what you want to do and get it done whenever you want to get it done. Who cares about truth? So you're the king of truth, big deal. It goes on, with this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. Can't find anything wrong with this guy. Verse 39, but it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Now, here's what's going on here. Every year at Passover, Pilate would try to be a nice guy and would bring out all these prisoners that had been arrested, and he would allow the people to choose one to set free because he was always arresting their leaders. So he says, do you want me to release, what does he call Jesus? The King of the Jews? And they shouted back, no, not him. Give us Barabbas. And it says, now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. Sometime earlier, Barabbas had raised an army to go against Rome, and as a result of that rebellion, hundreds of Jewish people had lost their lives. Sons and daughters had died, and they had actually turned against Barabbas because of this insurrection, and because of the loss of loved ones. The last person you would think they would want is Barabbas. Well, suddenly Pilate, who's in charge, his word is law, and he has all this power, suddenly he begins to feel a loss of control. And he doesn't realize something that you and I need to understand. Write this down. There is a kingdom from another place that is in control. There is a kingdom from another place that's in control. Pilate thought he could control any situation, including this one. But he's losing it. And he didn't understand there was an agenda here from an entirely different kingdom, the kingdom of God. And you cannot thwart God's agenda. Well, meanwhile, Pilate hears a rumor that the Jewish leaders are putting together a rebellion, and they're going to bring thousands of people to storm the palace if he doesn't make a decision about Jesus and do it quickly. So Pilate's really in a mess, and he's feeling pressure from the crowd. He knows there's pressure from the emperor to keep the peace. So now Pilate is in this real mess. There's something about Jesus that's unusual. He's not guilty of anything that would justify crucifixion. So what do you do in this situation? And suddenly the man who is in power, the man who has control, he seems to be losing both. And he makes a drastic decision. He makes a decision that no good leader would ever make. He makes a decision that kind of typifies what's going on inside of him. Look at chapter 19, verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. Now, you may have heard stories of what it means to be flogged. The instrument that was used was a Roman scourge. I'm going to show you kind of a picture of what it looked like. It was had a leather handle with 9 or more strips of leather at the ends, and at the ends they tied bits of steel or stone barbs, and so it was against the law to flog a Roman citizen. And no one could be flogged more than 39 lashes. It was against the law. Even the worst criminal, 39 was the stopping point. Now, when a man was flogged, it didn't simply cut him. It scraped the skin off the back, oftentimes to the bone. A good Roman flogger could do it not only in the back, but also the front and the back. Could just take it and just rip it to shreds. And generally, a person who was flogged bled to death. They were certainly scarred and maimed for life if they lived. So Pilate, he's trying to maintain control and get out of this situation, and he has an innocent man flogged within an inch of his life, and thinking that that's going to be enough for the people, that they would see him bloody and beaten and say, that's enough, he's been punished. Here's what happens in verse 2. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. In verse 4, once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. I've beaten him, and never once did he confess. I've brought him within an inch of his life. Never once did he beg for mercy. He didn't even offer to confess. If ever there was a man who was innocent, this man's innocent, because he's been driven to the point of exhaustion. If there was anything to confess, he would have admitted, because Pilate's seen a lot of men flogged, and he's seen them to confess to just about anything. Pilate knew he'd done something terrible. This was an innocent man. Look at verse 5. When Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." And as soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." But the Jews insisted, "We have a law. And according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." Now look at verse 9. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. Why was he afraid? Maybe he was afraid of the Jews. Maybe he was afraid because he knew Jesus was innocent. Maybe he was afraid that word would get back to Rome, and the emperor, who many times claimed himself to be God, would hear that Pilate had not put him to death for saying such a thing. And suddenly, the man who had worked all of his life to have this position of power and control finds it to be slipping away, and he doesn't know what to do. So he decides to question Jesus again. The verse continues. He went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave no answer. And that must have amazed Pilate, because the worst of criminals in flogging would confess. But Jesus hasn't said anything. And finally, Pilate lost it, and he admitted his own insecurity. In fact, he realized things weren't in control anymore, and he says this in verse 10, "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said, "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? Jesus, don't you realize that your hands are bound, my hands are free? I'm the governor, you're a criminal of an enslaved people. Your destiny is in my hands. I'm giving you an opportunity to defend yourself, to beg for mercy. Don't you get it? I decide whether you live or whether you die, and I even decide how you die." And Jesus gazes into those insecure eyes of Pilate, and he speaks some transformational words that they went right to the core of Pilate's insecurity. And if these words, if you would allow them to go to your insecurity, it would totally change your perspective of kings and thrones. Verse 11, Jesus answered, "You have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Pilate, you're not in charge. You're not in charge. You control nothing other than what has been granted from above. Pilate, my destiny and your destiny is in the hands of the same person, the king. You're not in control. Now let me stop here and just have you write this down. What little control that we have is given to us by God. See, there's a little Pilate in all of us, and we want to take our little bitty area of control, whether it's family or finances or business or whatever, and we live like we're in control. We live like we're the authority, and our destiny is in our hands. Yet deep inside, we know that's not true. Deep inside our hearts, there's this insecurity that we cover by fighting for control over these parts of our lives. And the thought of losing control terrorizes us. Jesus speaks into that insecurity, and he speaks into our insecurity and my insecurity, and he says, "Bobby, you would have no authority or control if it were not given to you from above. You're not in control." Pilate got it. I mean, look at verse 12. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. Why? I mean, how did it benefit him? He was scared to death of the emperor. He was scared of the Jewish people. Yet in this encounter, he knew there was a truth. And suddenly, truth that he had no interest in before, when confronted by this unique man, he realized that to allow this man to be crucified under his watch was a crime he would probably never be able to reconcile in his own heart. But the verse goes on, the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." And now Pilate is caught between two kings, the king in Rome and the bloodied king standing before him. Which one does he bow to? Which one does he say yes to? When everything in you says, stay in control, which king do you submit to? Verse 13. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. And it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. He kept calling him king, kept calling him king. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. And then in verse 16, this little word, finally. After wrestling with it, after deciding which king do I bow to, finally Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. What happened here? Pilate was afraid if he didn't give in, he would lose his control over the people. So let me give you one more thought here. It applies to us. Our fear of losing control makes us push for our agenda. Our fear of losing control of our marriage makes us push for our agenda in the marriage. Our fear of losing control over our finances makes us push for our agenda when it comes to our finances. Pick an area of your life. You want control and you fear losing it. So you push your agenda instead of God's agenda. And there's a clash of kings. What's really funny is about the same place last service that happened too. And I'm like, okay, somebody needs to find out something here. When we live from the standpoint of I must be in control of all things and events and people around me, our agenda is going to clash with God's agenda. And that take on life will bring you unbearable anxiety and fear, because it will wreak havoc with your ability to make decisions. Because like Pilate, your ability to make decisions will be clouded by your fear of losing control. It'll wreak havoc with your relationships because nobody wants to be controlled. Nobody. And if you think you must be in control, get in control, stay in control, you're going to have an impossible time loving people. Because you cannot control people and love them at the same time. People don't want to be controlled. They want to be unconditionally loved. You cannot unconditionally love and control at the same time. They're mutually exclusive. But I've got to tell you, having been on both sides of this equation myself, having a propensity of going back and forth quicker than you would think, quicker than I would like you to know, I can tell you this. We must abdicate the throne, or our agenda will clash with his. There will be a clash of kings. And when you realize that God has entrusted a very limited authority and power to you as a parent or as a boss, an employer, or whatever area, you have to realize that you're to be a good steward of that and to use it wisely and to make decisions based on not your agenda, but the agenda of the High King. You know what happened to Pilate? Just a few years later, there was an uprising in Samaria, the northern part of his rule. He didn't handle it very well. And so Tiberius Augustus, the Caesar, brought him back to Rome to face charges. Before he could stand before Tiberius, Tiberius died. The next emperor, Caligula, then took over, and he brought Pilate in. And he basically sentenced him to die. But he had a choice. He could either be executed by Rome, or he could commit suicide. Crazy world, wasn't it? Pilate chose suicide. He took his own life, but tradition tells us that they threw his body into the Tiber River. You cannot thwart God's agenda. And I want to encourage you today. This throne of your life needs a king, but it needs the king. And as much as you want to take control, pull the chair out into these certain areas, many of you are already paying the consequences for that because you wanted to control things. We want to control outcomes. You cannot control outcomes. Only God can control outcomes. And if you don't let him sit here, your agendas are going to clash. And we pay the consequences. So I want to encourage you today, abdicate the throne. Stop playing a Game of Thrones and allow him to be the king that he deserves.